The Dravosi long-range probe had been drifting for 11 years before it finally found something worth reporting. It was a small planet, blue and white from orbit, wrapped in cloud cover, sitting in a quiet corner of the outer arm where no empire had bothered to look. The probe's signal reached Fleet Admiral Vorn 3 weeks later. He read the report twice, then called his senior officers together and told them the same thing he told himself. This would be simple. The scans showed no active shields, no weapons platforms in orbit, no military signals on any frequency. There were satellites, but old ones, most of them dead, spinning uselessly above the atmosphere. The surface had cities, but the cities looked half abandoned. Roads had cracked. Large structures had gone dark. The population was scattered, living in small groups far from the old urban centers. Whatever this civilization had once been, it had clearly collapsed into something smaller and quieter. The Dravosi Empire had absorbed 42 worlds. 11 of them had looked exactly like this. Vorn took his flagship and 6 escort vessels into the system, standard formation. He did not bring the war fleet. There was no reason to. His communications officer broadcast the standard occupation message on all frequencies as they entered orbit. It announced the arrival of the Dravosi Empire, the terms of absorption, and the expectation of a response from whatever governing body still existed on the surface. The message was sent in 17 languages, using the probe's collected audio data to guess at local speech patterns. There was no response. Vorn waited 2 hours, still nothing. He ordered a second broadcast. He added a deadline this time. 6 hours for a response, or ground teams would land to establish direct contact. On the surface below, the broadcast came through on an old radio receiver inside a farm building near the edge of a flat, dry plain. The man who heard it was named Rold. He was 63 years old, had worked that land for most of his life, and had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that. Rold listened to the alien voice without moving. He understood none of the words, but he understood the tone well enough. He had heard recordings of that tone before. His grandfather had told him what it meant. He set down his tools and walked to the back of the building. There was a door there that had not been opened in his lifetime. It was made of heavy steel, painted green, with a symbol on it that was no longer used by any government on Earth. Below the symbol was a handwritten note, old and yellowed in its frame. The note was in his grandfather's handwriting. It said, "You will know when." Rold thought about that for a moment. Then he pulled open a small panel beside the door, entered a code that had been passed down through his family like a prayer, and waited. Deep under the ground, something clicked. He did not go inside. That was not his job. His job ended at the door. Above him, the 6 Dravosi escort ships finished their orbital sweep. The scan results were the same as before. No weapons, no shields, no military infrastructure. A dead world slowly coming back to life through farming and small settlements. Vorn's chief analyst called it a Category 3 absorption. Peaceful, resource-rich, minimal resistance expected. Vorn approved the ground deployment. 3 teams of 12 soldiers each landed at separate points across the northern continent. They wore light armor and carried standard-issue weapons. Their orders were to locate population centers, make visual contact with locals, and begin the process of establishing communication. The first team landed near an old highway and walked toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. The locals they spotted at a distance did not run. They just watched. One of them, a child, pointed. A woman pulled the child back inside. A man in a field stopped working and looked at the soldiers for a long time, then turned and walked away at a steady pace. Not running, just walking. The second team landed near a dry riverbed and found the remains of a large city. Most of the buildings were empty. They moved through wide streets without seeing anyone. Their team leader reported back that it felt like walking through a place that had been left in a hurry, except everything was clean. Too clean. No trash. No broken glass. just empty buildings with their doors closed and their windows dark. The third team never reported at all. Vaughn's communications officer flagged it after 40 minutes. The third team had confirmed their landing and begun their sweep. Then the signal stopped. Not disrupted, not cut off. Just stopped, like a light being switched off. Vaughn ordered the first and second teams to hold their positions and report everything they could see. Team 1 reported nothing unusual. Fields, buildings, empty roads. Team 2 reported a sound. The team leader described it as a low hum, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was coming from below the ground. The team leader said it reminded him of an engine that had just started up after sitting cold for a very long time. Vaughn pulled up the deep scan data on his console and ran a ground penetration sweep on the area where the third team had gone silent. The scan came back with something it could not identify, a structure underground, very large, larger than any of the buildings on the surface, larger than his flagship. The structure had not shown up on any of the probe's scans 11 years ago. That meant it had not been there 11 years ago. Or it had been there, and it had not wanted to be found. Vaughn told his weapons officer to bring the ship's guns online. The ground penetration scan ran 3 more times before Vaughn's analyst admitted he could not explain the result. The structure was not a building. It was too long, too dense, and it ran in multiple directions under the surface like the frame of something that had been assembled piece by piece over a very long time. The material it was made of reflected the scan in a way that the analyst had only seen once before, during a survey of an old weapons depot on a Dravosi colony world. Dense armor plating. The kind used not to protect a building, but to protect something that moved. Vaughn asked where the third team had gone silent. The analyst pointed to a spot directly above the center of the structure. The first and second teams were still holding position. Vaughn ordered them to begin moving toward the last known location of the third team, slowly, eyes on everything. Team 2 moved first. They crossed the dry riverbed and entered a stretch of open ground that the scans showed as flat. 3 minutes in, the team leader reported that the ground under their boots felt warm. Not hot, just warm, the way a road feels after sitting under a summer sun all day. Except there was no sun strong enough on this planet to heat packed Earth that deep. Team 1 was still moving through the farming area when one of the soldiers stopped and pointed at the ground. There was a line in the dirt, a straight line, too clean to be natural, running from east to west as far as they could see in both directions. The team leader crouched down and ran a finger along it. The earth on one side was normal. On the other side it was slightly raised, as if something underneath had shifted position very recently. He told the team to stop moving. His signal cut off 12 seconds later. Vaughn had been watching both feeds. He sat very still for a moment after the second silence. Then he turned to his deployment officer and asked how many soldiers were available for a second landing. The answer was 80. He sent all 80, along with 4 combat drones and 2 sensor units. He told the drone operators to keep their units in the air at all times. He told the sensor team to map everything underground within a 2-kilometer radius of the landing zone. He wanted to know what he was dealing with before anything else disappeared. The 80 soldiers landed in a wide clearing near where the first team's signal had gone dark. The drones went up immediately. The sensor units spread out and began their sweep. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the sensor team reported a reading that made no sense. The underground structure was not stationary. Parts of it were moving, slowly but moving. The movement was not random. It was organized. Things were locking into place, one after another in a sequence. One of the drone feeds caught something on the surface. A flat section of ground near the edge of the clearing had cracked along a perfectly straight line. As the drone hovered closer, the crack widened. Dirt fell away on both sides. The edges of something metal appeared below, gray and pitted with age but solid. A hatch. The drone moved to hold position directly above it. The hatch did not open. Below the surface, the movement continued. The sensor team was tracking 17 separate points of activity now, all underground, all within half a kilometer of the landing zone. Whatever was down there had a lot of moving parts, and all of them were heading towards something like a ready state. The soldier nearest to the hatch took 3 steps toward it. The hatch opened. Nothing came out. It just opened slowly, like a door being unlocked from the inside to let someone know they were welcome to leave. The edges ground against packed earth as it rose. The space below was dark. The drone lowered its light and swept the interior. Concrete walls. Metal ladders bolted to the sides going down further than the drone's light could reach. Cables running along the ceiling in thick bundles. And on the far wall, a single panel of instruments, old and analog, with one gauge still moving. A needle, climbing slowly from left to right. The sensor team called in from the west side of the clearing. They had found 3 more hatches. All of them were opening. Vorn's weapons officer reported that the ship's orbital guns were trained on the landing zone and ready to fire on his order. Vorn did not give the order. Not yet. What he saw on the feeds did not look like an attack. It looked like a machine waking up because something nearby had told it to. The soldiers had not triggered it. The landing had not triggered it. It had started before they ever touched the ground. He pulled up the timeline from the initial broadcast. The underground movement had started 4 hours after the first occupation message was sent. Not when the ships entered orbit. Not when the ground teams landed. 4 hours after the broadcast. Something on this planet had heard the message, understood what it meant, and responded. Not with weapons, not with soldiers. With a key turning in a very old lock. Vorn zoomed in on the sensor map. The structure below the surface was enormous, and it was almost done waking up. It did not rise all at once. That was the part that stayed with the drone operators long after the footage was reviewed. They had expected something sudden, an explosion of Earth, a fast reveal. Instead it came up slowly, over the course of almost 20 minutes in sections. The northern edge first, then the center mass, then the southern end, pushing through packed soil and broken concrete like something that had done this before and saw no reason to hurry. By the time the full silhouette was visible against the afternoon sky, Vorn had called in his remaining 3 escort vessels and repositioned them in a tight formation above the landing zone. His weapons officer had a firing solution ready. His analyst was still trying to calculate the size of what they were looking at. The structure was not a vehicle in any shape Dravosi engineers had ever designed. It was wide and flat on top, with layers of plating that overlapped like scales, and from the underside came 4 thick support columns that pressed into the earth as it settled at the surface. It had no visible cockpit, no windows, no obvious point of entry from the outside. What it had were arrays. Long rows of cylindrical units mounted along the upper edges, each one rotating slowly on independent joints, scanning the sky the way a person might scan a crowd looking for someone they recognized. The sensor team confirmed it was approximately 3 kilometers long. One of the drone operators later said he had felt a change in the air when it finished rising. Not temperature, not wind, more like pressure. The feeling a person gets in a closed room when a large machine turns on in the next room and the whole building begins to hum. Then a voice came through on every frequency simultaneously. It spoke in 17 languages, the same 17 languages Vorn had used in his occupation broadcast. It had learned them all from that one transmission 4 hours ago. The message was the same in every language. Short, flat, no emotion in the tone. You are in a protected system. Leave now or be engaged. Vorn's communications officer looked at him. Vorn said nothing for a long moment. He asked his analyst whether the structure's weapons arrays were active. The analyst said they were running what looked like a targeting cycle, not locked onto anything yet, just scanning. Vorn asked if there was any signal indicating a human operator inside the structure. The analyst checked. No life signs inside, no communications traffic in or out except the broadcast. The structure was running on its own. That was the detail that changed Vorn's thinking. An automated system had limits. It had programming, rules, a finite set of responses. It could not improvise. It could not negotiate. It was a machine, and machines could be overwhelmed. He ordered his 4 vessels into firing positions and told his weapons officer to target the upper arrays. Take out the weapons first, then work down to the support columns. He wanted it disabled, not destroyed. There was more to learn from it intact. The first volley hit the northern array directly. The cradle's shields absorbed it without any visible effect. The weapons officer reported that the energy reading from the impact had dispersed across the entire upper surface evenly, like water spreading across a flat plate. There was no concentrated point of damage. The shields were not localized. They covered the whole structure as a single layer. The second volley was heavier. All 4 ships fired at the same point on the northern array. Same result. The cradle had not fired back. It had not moved. Its arrays were still rotating slowly, still scanning. The targeting cycle had not changed. Then it changed. All at once, every array on the upper surface stopped rotating and pointed in the same direction, upward, directly at Vorn's flagship. The analyst said, very quietly, that the cradle had just completed a target lock. Vorn ordered full shields. The cradle fired once. The beam was thin and lasted less than a second. It passed through the flagship's shields as if they were not there and cut across the ship's secondary engine housing with a sound that everyone on the bridge heard clearly even through the hull. The engines did not explode. They simply stopped working. The flagship began to drift. Damage reports came in fast. The secondary engines were gone. The portside maneuvering thrusters were gone. 3 decks had lost power. 17 crew were injured, none dead. The cradle had not aimed to destroy. It had aimed to disable. Then it spoke again, on every frequency. 1 warning used, 2 remain. Vorn gripped the edge of his console and looked at the image on the main screen. The structure sat below on the surface of the planet, calm and flat and enormous, with its arrays already rotating again. Back to scanning, as if what had just happened was a minor entry in a very long log. He asked his analyst how old the structure was based on the material composition of the plating. The analyst ran the numbers twice. He said the cradle was at least 130 years old. Vorn looked at the screen for a while longer. Then he asked the same question he had been turning over since the 3rd ground team went silent. If this was what the humans had left running on automatic after 130 years, what had they decided was too dangerous to leave running? 300 kilometers above Earth, a small ship dropped out of a short-range transit fold. It was not a military vessel. It had no weapons, no shields worth mentioning, and its hull had the scratched and patched look of something that spent most of its time moving between low-orbit stations and surface settlements. It broadcast its identity on open frequency without being asked. A civilian transport registered to a settlement called Holt Station in the northern continent. 2 people aboard. No cargo. Vorn's communications officer flagged it immediately. The woman who opened the channel from that ship did not introduce herself with a rank or a title. She said her name was Dara. She said she was one of the people responsible for the structure on the surface. She asked, in careful and deliberate words translated through the probe's language data, if she could speak directly with whoever was in command of the Dravosi fleet. Vorn took the channel. Dara asked him how many warnings he had used. He told her 1. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was good. She said she needed him to understand something before he used the second one, because the second one would change the situation in a way that she was not sure she could reverse. Vorn asked her what she meant. She explained it without drama, the way a person reads from a document they have read many times before. The structure on the surface, which her people called the cradle, was not the main defense system. It was the lock on the main defense system. It was designed to hold, absorb, and deter. Its job was to stop a conflict before it became something larger. If it was destroyed, or if it detected an attack above a certain threshold, it would interpret that as a failure of its deterrence function. And when it determined that deterrence had failed, it was programmed to release the systems it was currently containing. Vorn asked what systems. Dara said she would send him a file. The file arrived in seconds. It was a technical document, very old, written in a human language that the translation system struggled with in places because some of the terminology was no longer in common use. But the diagrams were clear enough. Weapons platforms, autonomous units, underground launch systems distributed across the planet. Systems that had been sealed and locked behind the cradle after the last war, because the humans who survived that war had decided those systems were too destructive to ever use again. They had not destroyed them. They had locked them away and put a guardian in front of them. The cradle was not the weapon. It was the door that kept the weapons from getting out. Vorn read through the file twice. His analyst confirmed that the energy signatures described in the document matched underground readings they had been detecting since the cradle surfaced, at locations spread across multiple continents. He looked at the image of Dara on the channel screen. She was older, somewhere past middle age, with short hair and an expression that was tired rather than afraid. He asked her why she had not led with this information, why she had waited until now. She said that for the first generation after the war, her people had hoped no one would ever come. For the second generation, they had argued about whether to dismantle it all. By the third generation, the knowledge had narrowed down to a small number of families, the ones who had agreed to stay close to the old sites and maintain them. She was the fourth generation. Her job had always been the same: watch, and only speak if someone actually came. She said no, one had come for 130 years. Vorn told her that he had brought 12 ships into this system, and that more could be called. She nodded as if she had expected him to say something like that. She said she understood. Then she said the cradle had been designed by people who had also understood. People who had survived a war fought with the things behind that door, and who had decided that the only acceptable outcome was that no one ever opened it again. They built the cradle to be difficult to destroy, gave it enough firepower to discourage any aggressor without starting a full exchange, and added a failsafe that made destroying the cradle worse than leaving it alone. She said, "I am not threatening you. I am reading you the manual." Vorn turned to his analyst and asked for a projected outcome if the fleet opened a full bombardment on the cradle. The analyst ran the numbers. At current shield strength, the cradle would hold against standard bombardment for between 4 and 7 minutes before the failsafe threshold was reached. After that, based on the signatures already detected underground, the secondary systems would begin activating within 90 seconds. He asked how many secondary sites there were. The analyst checked the file Dara had sent. 61 confirmed locations across the planet. Vorn looked back at Dara on the screen. She had not moved. She was watching him the way someone watches a person standing at the edge of something they cannot take back from. He asked her one question. He said, "What exactly is behind the door?" She looked down for a moment. When she looked back up, her expression had not changed, but something behind her eyes had. She said, "We stopped counting after the third continent." The reinforcement fleet arrived 6 hours later. Vorn had called them in before Dara's ship had even appeared on his sensors. 37 additional warships, pulled from the nearest Dravosi staging point 2 systems over. They entered orbit in formation, spread wide, and took up positions that covered every quadrant above the planet's surface. From the ground, it would have looked like a ring of metal closing around the sky. Dara's ship was still holding its position between the Dravosi fleet and Earth. She had not left. She had not moved closer either. She just waited, which Vorn found more unsettling than most things that had happened in the past 12 hours. He had spent the 6 hours reading everything in the file she had sent. His analyst had spent the same 6 hours trying to verify it against the underground sensor data. The conclusions were not comfortable. The file was accurate. What was sealed under those 61 sites matched the energy profiles the sensors were detecting. Whatever the humans had buried down there, it was real, it was old. And according to every projection the analyst could run, it was not something the fleet could destroy before it came fully online. Vorn called Dara back on the channel. He told her that he had 49 ships now. He asked if she wanted to revise her assessment of the situation. She said no. He asked if her people had any intention of surrendering the planet voluntarily. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Surrender to what end? We have nothing you need that requires our cooperation. Take the planet and you take the door. Take the door and the things behind it become your problem." Vorn said that was a very calm way to describe an occupation. She said she had read a lot of history. Calm was the only useful thing she could offer at this point. Vorn told her he was going to attempt a different approach. He ordered 2 of his heaviest warships to reposition to the southern hemisphere, above one of the 61 flagged underground sites. Not the cradle's position, one of the secondary sites. He wanted to see what happened when a site was isolated and targeted independently, without triggering the cradle's main failsafe. The 2 ships moved into position and began a low-power scan of the site below. Nothing happened for about 4 minutes. Then the cradle's arrays, which had been rotating in their usual slow sweep, stopped. All of them. At the same time. They held still for exactly 3 seconds. Then every array rotated as one unit and pointed directly at the 2 southern ships. It had noticed. Vorn ordered the 2 ships to hold position and not fire. The cradle did not fire either. It just kept its arrays pointed at the southern ships, completely ignoring everything else in orbit. Dara's voice came through the channel again. She said, "It's not guarding the sites. It's guarding the connections between the sites. They're linked underground. Move against any one of them and the cradle treats it the same as a move against all of them." Vorn asked how she knew that. She said, "Because my grandmother wrote the maintenance notes, and I memorized them when I was 12. He told the southern ships to pull back. The cradle's arrays returned to their normal rotation. Vorn sat back in his chair and looked at the tactical map. 49 ships, 1 damaged. A planet below with no army, no visible military, no government that had even responded to his occupation broadcast. Just farms and old settlements, and a woman in a civilian ship who kept answering his questions with the patience of someone who had expected this conversation her entire life. He asked her, "Who built all of this?" She said, "People who were very good at war, people who got tired of being good at it." He asked, "And the people alive now, the ones in the settlements?" She said most of them knew the cradle was there in the same way people know a river runs under their city. It was part of the land. It was not part of their daily lives. Some of the older families knew more. A few, like hers, knew everything. But the general population had spent 4 generations building something that did not need the old machines. They had left the machines in place not because they wanted to use them, but because they had not found a better answer to the question of what to do if someone came. Vorn said, "And now someone came." She said, "And now someone came." He looked at the damage report on his secondary engines. He looked at the tactical map. He looked at the image of 49 ships arranged in a perfect formation above a planet that had not fired a single weapon in 4 generations, and still had not fired first. He asked his communications officer to open a fleet-wide channel. His officers on the bridge went still. He told them he was going to send a full report back to Dravosi High Command. He told them the report would include the cradle's specifications, the secondary site data, and his own recommendation. He did not say what the recommendation would be out loud. His officers knew him well enough to guess from his face. He closed the fleet channel and looked at Dara's feed. He said, "I need time." She said, "That is the first thing you have asked for that I can actually give you." The High Command's response came in 48 hours. Vorn read it alone in his quarters. He read it twice. Then he went to the bridge and told his communications officer to open a channel to Dara's ship. She answered immediately. He suspected she had not slept. He told her that the Dravosi Empire's High Command had reviewed his report and reached a conclusion. He said he would read it to her directly, so there was no confusion about the words. He read, "The target system presents an unacceptable risk profile for standard absorption. The automated defense infrastructure cannot be neutralized without triggering secondary systems whose projected operational capacity exceeds current fleet engagement parameters at the staging level. Recommend withdrawal and reclassification of the system as restricted. No further contact pending strategic review." He lowered the document and looked at her on the screen. She asked him what restricted meant in practice. He said it meant that no Dravosi ship was supposed to enter the system without authorization from High Command. In practice, it meant the system would be flagged on every navigation chart in the Empire. He said no captain wanted a restricted system on their route log. The paperwork alone was enough to keep most of them away. She asked, "And the strategic review?" He said, "Those last for decades when no one wants to deal with them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him if he personally agreed with the decision. He thought about the question longer than he expected to. He had spent 41 years in the Dravosi fleet. He had overseen the absorption of 9 worlds. None of them had looked back at him the way this planet had. Most of them had armies, weapons, governments that made demands, and then surrendered when the demands failed. This planet had sent one woman in a civilian ship to read him a very old manual. He told her, "I think your people understood something that most civilizations don't get the chance to understand." She asked what that was. He said that winning a war is easy. It's building something that makes the next war not worth starting that is hard. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "We had a lot of help figuring that out. The old kind of help, the kind that costs everything." He said he understood. He told her the fleet would begin its withdrawal within the hour. His damaged flagship would need a tow to the transit point, which he found personally embarrassing. He said it as a plain fact. She almost smiled at that. Before he closed the channel, he asked her one last thing. He said, "The missing soldiers, my 3 ground teams, what happened to them?" She said, "They're fine. They were collected by the Cradle's ground units and moved to a sealed area underground. Standard containment, not a hostile act. The Cradle doesn't kill unless it has to. It was designed that way on purpose." Vorn asked if his soldiers would be released. She said they already have been. They're on the surface now, near the original landing zones. I imagine they are very confused and very grateful. He nodded. He said thank you. It was the first time in the entire exchange that he had used those words. She said, "Don't come back." He said, "That is a very reasonable request." The Dravosi fleet pulled out of orbit over the next 90 minutes. The damaged flagship went last, dragged by a pair of support vessels, its secondary engines still cold and dark from the Cradle's single shot. The last Dravosi ship crossed out of the planet's gravity well as the local sun was setting over the northern continent. On the surface, the cradle stayed where it was through the night. Its arrays kept their slow rotation. Its shield stayed up. It was not in a hurry to go back underground. The old systems ran their own checks on their own schedules, and the cradle had learned over 130 years that there was no point rushing any of it. Dara landed her ship in a field near Holt Station around midnight. Her daughter was waiting near the landing pad. No one else. The settlement was quiet and dark the way small places are quiet and dark when the people inside them have decided that whatever was happening in the sky was not their problem. Her daughter asked if it was over. Dara said for now. Her daughter asked, "Do you think they'll come back?" Dara thought about Vorn's face on the channel screen, the way he had read the High Command's report in a flat voice, and then waited to see how she would respond. The question he had asked at the end about the soldiers, the way he had said thank you as if it cost him something. She said not him, someone else eventually, someone who hasn't read the file. Her daughter asked, and then. Dara looked back at the sky. The cradle was somewhere out there in the dark, still watching, still running its slow scan of the upper atmosphere the way it had every night for as long as anyone in her family could remember. She said, then the cradle reads them the same manual. She picked up her bag and walked inside. Behind her, the landing pad light clicked off on its timer. The field went dark. The sky above was clear and full of stars, and every one of them for at least another generation was someone else's problem.